We have an incredible program with expert panelists, all of whom we will be hearing about and from in just a few moments. I will now introduce Dr. Shabana Mir, who will be serving as the moderator, and Dr. Mir will go through a bit of the program with us for this evening. Dr. Shabana Mir is Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of Undergraduate Studies at American Islamic College. She teaches Islamic studies, gender studies, and research methods. She is the author of the award-winning book, Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2014. The book has received the Outstanding Book Award and the National Association for Ethnic Studies and the Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Shabana Mir.
Thank you so much, Romana. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to American Islamic College and to this event, which we are delighted to hold in partnership with Vigilant Love, Justice for Muslims Collective, and Heart Women and Girls, which is comprises the partnership to end gendered Islamophobia. I know some of you have questions about that title. And I'm just very excited to welcome these three young Muslim organizers to this event and to introduce them to you as they are friends of mine, and I'm just so happy to know them. First of all, I'm going to introduce Yazan. Yazan Zaza is the community organizer at Vigilant Love, an anchor organization in the Partnership to End Gendered Islamophobia. Yazan's work includes the development of political analysis, campaign strategy, and educational facilitation for the organization, with special attention to the overlaps between gender, racialization, and surveillance. Yazan holds an MA in Women and Gender Studies from San Diego State University. Their research focuses on the relationship between war, migration, surveillance, and social welfare programming. And next, I'm delighted to also introduce Sahar Pirzada. Sahar is a Pakistani-American Muslim woman from the Bay Area. She is the Advocacy and West Coast Programs Manager for HEART, where she explores the intersections of Islamophobia and gender-based violence and supports survivors of sexual violence in the Muslim community. She has a master's in social work from USC and is also the co-director of Vigilant Love, where she actively challenges Islamophobia through arts and organizing. Sahar's work has been featured in Teen Vogue, NPR, KPCC, Fusion Sex Right Now, and hashtag Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And my dear friend, Daraksha Raja, who she currently serves as co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective and leads JMC's power building programming against structural Islamophobia in the greater Washington, D.C. region, and national advocacy efforts on gendered Islamophobia through the Partnership to End Gendered Islamophobia. We call it PEGI. Daraksha holds a master's in forensic psychology from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and she is also a graduate of the Rockwood Leadership Program for South Asian Muslim and Arab women leaders. She currently serves on the DC government Street Harassment Advisory Committee as a religious tolerance appointee to implement the Street Harassment Prevention Act in the District of Columbia. She also serves on the board of Consumer Health Foundation. So we have some amazing people here today. And I know you're thinking that this is rather a shift from our usual events. And let me tell you why. So this event, you can tell by the title that there is a component of storytelling to it. And we're going to really address that more after the first component, where we're going to introduce you to what we call the Gendered Islamophobia Report. And you'll learn more about it from our three guests. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit to our three guests and to learn a little bit about what it's like to be an organizer and why and how they came to this work of organizing. I know that as an academic myself, the very word organizing didn't mean much to me at first. So I want to bring that to my community. And then I tell you why I'm so excited about this event. I put together this event in partnership with these friends of mine, particularly because first of all, this event marks Women's History Month in March. It's also an introduction for many of our community members to why we need organizing. And what are some of the organizations that are organizing our communities in response to a number of urgent issues? We know of those issues, but what are our organizers helping do something about it? And how are they developing that strategy and that map for how to go about addressing these issues? Now, I'm an immigrant myself, so I'm constantly trying to educate myself on the politics of justice and injustice in this country. And I'm trying to scrape the surface of justice talk to see what's actually going on in this country. And in the past several years, all of us have been watching very carefully through the Trump years and before that, right? We've seen a lot of mobilization. We've seen mobilization for electoral politics, for racial justice, for poverty elimination, the Muslim ban, xenophobia, the wall, all these kinds of things. And I've been looking at all of these issues, examining them, and puzzling over how to connect all these dots, but particularly as a Muslim, right? How do I connect them as a Muslim, as a woman, as an American, as a global citizen, and as a person who is told by the Quran to always stand for justice? Right. So I'm trying to puzzle out, and I hear so many voices, and sometimes I can't tell from one from the other. And so I started paying more attention to certain voices because of how they connected the dots of faith, justice, international oppression, gendered violence, and social equity. And it turned out these were the voices that I was paying attention to. These were the voices of Muslim organizers. And so that's why I ended up being in engagement with them. And I'm basically trying to learn at their feet. I'm an academic. Our training is very individualistic and often very theoretical and very disconnected from our communities. So it's been me trying to learn from community centering organizers on how we address problems of injustice in our communities, in our society, in our world, and using a faith-centered analysis. So as we conclude this terrible Trump era, then some people start to get smug, but we also remain aware that we have to organize continuously. And if we are to become a force to be reckoned with, we must be in solidarity with other communities for any kind of impact. So this event is for our Muslim communities to try to understand what is this report on gendered Islamophobia, and to hear from the frontline organizers who are actively working to dismantle gendered Islamophobia. And what does that mean for you as a person? So I'm going to, at this point, hand it over. Stop talking. Academics have a difficult time doing that. But I'm going to hand it over at this point to Yazan, Sahar, and Darakhshan, and they will together present the report on gendered Islamophobia. So please welcome them.
Okay. Sorry, my bad. I thought that Sarah, you were up by accident. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Shabana Mir, for having us here and to present in terms of talking about a report on gendered Islamophobia. I also want to thank you because I think that there's a lot more work to be done to bridge academics and organizers together. So thank you for acknowledging that, you know, there's a lot of knowledge directly from impacted communities that is important to center, and that the work of organizers and those on the front lines is really important to take into account. And I think in that same sort of vein, the analysis that we're going to be presenting today is very much rooted and comes from the direct experiences of community members who are survivors, and also from the work that all three of us have been doing in community for decades now. So with that, I'm going to start a little bit and talk about, you know, our framework of gendered Islamophobia. What is it? How did we build it? And then from there, Sahar will do an incredible job going deeper into gender-based violence. And Yazin will present sort of a case study around one of the ways that gendered Islamophobia shows up at the intersection of surveillance. Great, wonderful. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd love to talk about, oh, great. Do we want to do, I think we did our brief introductions already of who we are. Great, if we go to the next slide. So in order to understand, really position what is gendered Islamophobia, when we sat together, and this is from the work of Justice for Muslims Collective, which is a community-based organization in Washington, D.C., we organize against Islamophobia. And so we really tried to position it within these sort of three sort of systemic forms of violence. One is structural violence, which I will get into a little bit deeper in a minute, structural Islamophobia, and then the third is this piece around patriarchy and gender-based violence in particular. And so in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we define what is structural violence, since that is something that we're going to be using as a framework and a terminology all along the entire presentation. But also if you look at our work, our reports, we constantly come back to talking about structural violence to make sure we don't minimize it just at the individual level as someone who just hates you, is ignorant or whatever. We're talking about systems here of the state, of institutions, and historically, the ways in which violence has been normalized and codified through the state. So the definition of structural violence, if we go to the next slide, and the next slide. So this is a definition that I picked up from the Center for Health Equity and Research in Chicago. So what structural violence is, it refers to the multiple ways in which social, economic, and political systems expose particular populations to risks and vulnerabilities. And this has a direct consequence on particularly quality of life. So when I'm talking about quality of life, I'm speaking about access to healthcare, access to education, access to housing, access to mobility, literally every sphere that we are talking about where, you know, your quality of life is measured. This systems of violence, systemic violence and structural violence particularly, hampers communities, harms communities. And you see that there's a reason why, if we talk about specifically African-American communities are dying at much more faster rates than wealthier white communities. That is because of structural violence. It is because of systemic histories of dehumanization and degradation. The other thing I just want to say very broadly around structural violence is that it is multiple systems. So it's not just Islamophobia, it's not just racism, it's not just sexism and ableism, it's literally everything that you can think about in terms of how society is organized around power, hierarchy, who gets resources, who doesn't, who's seen as human and deserving of life and rights and who is not. That is what I'm talking about when we say structural violence. And so in that same vein, using this framework, if we go to the next slide, at JMC, we sort of formed an understanding of how we see Islamophobia. And the ways in which we really define structural Islamophobia, I'll be going into that a little bit right here. Again, not spending too much time because I want to get to the structural forms of gendered Islamophobia, is just to say, what is our framework around it? So it's a systemic dehumanization and otherization of Muslim communities and Islam. And I think it's really important to not only mention Muslims, but also Islam in particular. It is a system of violence constructed by the state. So really important to center that this is a form of violence that states are actually creating and enabling. And then as a consequence, you see it enabled through social societies and people in particular. And that constantly when we talk about Islamophobia at the structural level, whether in the US or even in other countries where we're seeing it, it's this constant construction of Muslims as a foreign security threat. Even when Muslims are indigenous to that country, you will see that they're being depicted as foreign security threats if you look at the example of India, for example. And I think what is really important to keep in mind is that this system serves somebody. It is meant for the purpose of maintaining and expanding power, domination, and control by the state. And very important to note that it is the accumulation and interaction of systemic Islamophobia over a prolonged period of time that results in the incorporation of Islamophobia into the dominant systems of society. The reason I'm mentioning that is because in the United States, even within our own Muslim communities, there is sometimes a perception that Islamophobia started post 9/11. Even though if you look at historically, Islamophobia pre-existed even the foundation of a settler colonial American state. It's been here. So really unpacking some of these ways that we whitewash history and see that Islamophobia somehow just came out of nowhere as a post 9/11 phenomena, it absolutely is not. So then building off of this, if we go to the next slide, just some very quick manifestations of structural Islamophobia. government policies, laws, and programs. Again, Yazin and Seher will go a little bit deeper into that. Political exclusion. One very quick example I want to share. We've seen the visceral ways that Muslim women in office have been targeted. And it is their womanhood, their race, but also them being Muslim in particular. Constantly this idea that Muslims cannot be in political office. They are other, they are a foreign threat. This is somehow, I mean, all of the terrible ways we've seen Representative Ilhan Omar, Representative Rashida Tlaib targeted, but even anytime Muslims even run for office, we have seen that political exclusion and the targeting because of their Muslim identity. And then the third piece is the normalization of social exclusion and cultural violence. Not going to take up too much time, but I think we've seen the ways in which the right-wing Islamophobes have targeted anytime there's a construction of a mosque, anytime Muslims want to take up community or sort of physical space, you see the targeting happening against our communities in particular. So now moving on to the piece around gendered Islamophobia. And again, I would recommend, definitely feel free to look at justiceformuslims.org's website. We have a much more deeper dive into the different forms of Islamophobia. And I think in the next slide, you'll see a little bit of the circle and the depiction of how we look at Islamophobia. So I don't know if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so basically, the next one. And so basically, this is just a diagram depiction of how we look at the 4 layers of Islamophobia: structural, institutional, interpersonal, and then internalized. And again, I won't go too much deeper into it, but if you look at our website, you will see the definitions of each one of these. So now moving into getting into gendered Islamophobia. So I sort of covered structural violence, structural Islamophobia. And the reason I did that is because in order to go deeper into the definition of specifically structural gendered Islamophobia, I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page around understanding that we define it as something that is a form of violence constructed by the state and includes laws, policies, programs, and is much more complex than just, for example, hate violence, which is where often what we focus a lot of attention of Islamophobia on. Great, if I could go to the next slide. So in terms of a very brief kind of a definition of what is gendered Islamophobia. So when we define gendered Islamophobia at JMC, we're referring to the ways in which the state utilizes gendered forms of violence to oppress, monitor, punish, maim, and control Muslim bodies. And when I'm referring to gendered forms of violence, we're talking about the use of sexual violence, the use of torture, the use of harassment, the use of murder, the use of state reproductive control, coercion, and violence. It is also the ways in which, if we go into the next slide, the ways in which gender binaries in particular are used and constructed around depicting sort of in negative social constructions of Muslim women and girls. When we are referring to Muslim women on one end of the spectrum, I think Shabanaji, if you can, whoever's doing the slide, if you can go to the next one, that'd be great. So in terms of when we're talking about negative social constructions of Muslim women and girls, we're talking about Muslim women on one end of the spectrum being depicted as security threats themselves. So you've often seen Muslim women being seen as supporters of Muslim men who are terrorists, mothers, within a support role. But even more and more so over the years, we've seen that there's been training, for example, been done by Department of Homeland Security, by ICE, by CBP, that really talks about Muslim women as suicide bombers, as security threats ourselves. So on one end of the spectrum, we're this threat to the security of the state. On the other end of the spectrum, we are these, powerless. We lack agency. We have no voice. We don't matter. We're always oppressed by Muslim men, and hence we need to be saved by Muslim men. There's also the full erasure of anyone who is not fits within the binaries of male and female. So you see the erasure of Muslims who are trans, who are queer, who identify as femmes, who identify as non-binary, because of the assumption that Muslim communities are inherently homophobic and transphobic. And then the other thing is also that Muslim women and girls in particular are seen as the cultural and Islamic religious sort of representatives of the community. And hence we know that the bodies of women and girls have always been sites of domination and control. And I think if you take that analysis into heart, report, then you can see why that the majority of victims of hate violence tend to be Muslim women and girls, and that the people who are responsible for that violence tend to be white men who are engaging in that violence often. So in terms of, we can go into the next slide. Yeah, I think we can keep moving from that. I already covered a little bit about the negative social constructions. And this just very quickly, because the next sort of diagram is going to talk about a continuum of how specifically the different ways that gendered Islamophobia and gender-based violence interact with each other. And so if you go to the next slide, you will see this spectrum. So we created this spectrum to try to get a better understanding of when we're talking about explicit forms of violence towards Muslim women and girls, from hate crimes, murder, rape, drone attacks, war, genocide, the mass exclusion of Muslim women, whether you're talking about niqab bans, burqa bans, where you're talking about employment discrimination against Muslim women, whether here or whether in Europe, really remembering that violence falls on a spectrum and that the harmful narratives, the ways in which the microaggressions, the things that we tolerate on this other end of the spectrum allow for then this violence to escalate on the much more further end of what we see when it comes to gender-based violence and specifically gendered Islamophobia. And again, y'all can read this in the report if you want to go specific examples. I also encourage you all to use this as a tool yourself to map out the different ways that gendered Islamophobia, especially on a spectrum, think about it. How do harmful narratives then create the environment for which then Muslim women are killed, murdered, and excluded? It starts at a certain space that might not be necessarily explicit forms of violence that are physical, but they absolutely manifest over time into physical violence against our communities. And then just moving along. Next slide. I think there's and then just finishing, I want to wrap off in particularly this piece around the gendered Islamophobia violence pyramid to really just remind ourselves, going back to that first slide of the three sort of circles between structural violence, structural Islamophobia, and then gender-based violence and patriarchy, that gendered Islamophobia falls on this pyramid where constantly violence against Muslim women and girls falls on this sort of interaction between state, government, institutional violence, the broader social society, media, people who take it upon themselves, vigilantes, who think that they're enforcing a certain form of control and order. We know that hate violence is deeply tied to state violence. And then of course, also within our own community, who do we center in our advocacy? You look at the majority of Islamophobia civil rights work, does it have a gendered analysis in it? I would say often it doesn't, beyond just the Muslim identity of Muslim women. Family level, how do we treat women and girls within our own families? The interpersonal relationships, there's violence we know against women and girls within that. And then the internalized way, how do we then take on and internalize the negative dominant messages of the state? And then how do we perpetuate that violence towards other Muslim women and girls, not just here, but also abroad? So really using this as a tool. Again, it is all in our report. I hope that you all read it and sit with it. And of course, we're always open to hearing your feedback and your involvement. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to the amazing Seher, who's going to go a little bit deeper into gender-based violence as well. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dee. That was so great. And so I'm going to actually be taking a kind of deeper dive into specifically gender-based violence. So if we can go to the next slide. So we came to this workshop not assuming that anyone had exposure to any parts of this. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. We're happy to kind of go even deeper in certain ways if it's helpful. But just to give a basic overview of gender-based violence, for those who are unfamiliar with HEART, we are a reproductive justice organization that works on both understanding and addressing gender-based violence in Muslim communities and its links to sexual and reproductive health. And so a lot of this is very, very much tied to each other, but gender-based violence at its very basic form is violence, and if you can go to the next slide, is violence that is directed at an individual based on their biological sex or gender identity. And it can be actual or perceived. And it includes physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, psychological abuse. And this can be manifested through threats, coercion, economic or educational deprivation. And it's, this is happening both in the public sphere as well as within people's private lives. And, you know, when people think of it, oftentimes they think it's like these one-off instances, but we really want to bring back the fact that this is systemic, right? This is because of the way our society is set up, that enables gender inequity. So it's by design, based on the way that our society is set up, that gender-based violence exists. And if we can go to the next slide. So kind of talking about what falls under this umbrella, you have different forms of sexual violence, such as sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. What I want to get at here is that when we're talking about gendered Islamophobia, we're talking about the ways that the state sanctions these types of gender-based violence, right? So it's not divorced from the ways that the state is actually allowing for gender-based violence to happen, and actually is responsible for how gender-based violence is happening for Muslim communities. So it's kind of, you know, it's not like a lot of times the solutions to gender-based violence, people think that they have to rely on the state for it without realizing that the state is complicit in enacting gender-based violence as well, right? So when we're thinking of child abuse, for example, well, what's happening with regards to child abuse that's happening in detention centers? When we're thinking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, well, what about those who are, you know, agents of the state, such as cops who are engaged in intimate partner violence, and you have survivors who can't go to the police to file a police report because they're filing a police report against the very people who are supposed to be protecting them, or that they're filing against, right? When you're thinking about, and we'll get to some of these examples later, but one that I really want to hone in on is when it comes to informancy of FBI agents, right? So you have FBI agents who are pretending as if they're part of Muslim communities, coming into Muslim communities being like, hey, I'm Muslim, I'm whatever. They make up their own profile. They get into actual relationships, romantic relationships with women in the community under these false pretenses, and engage in like romantic relationships where they're physically, sexually intimate with folks, but there's no informed consent. They're not revealing to the women that they're engaging in that they are FBI agents, right? So that's state sanctioned sexual violence because you are not getting informed consent. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this is gender-based violence that is happening by state agents under the banner of, well, this is still a case of national security, and we have to do this under the name of, you know, fighting the war on terror, right? As well as using different forms of sexual violence in war and in the actual war on terror in Muslim majority countries or against Muslim bodies. And if you go to the next slide. So, you know, when we're thinking about then solutions, right, to address gender-based violence, oftentimes folks go to these kind of surface level kind of, well, you know, in order to challenge gender-based violence, we just need to have a workshop, right? And we're like, I mean, as Heart, we love doing workshops, and also that's not going to be the full solution, right? So they're like, oh, we just need to do a workshop, or we need to just come up with a reporting mechanism, right? And we're like, yes, and those are actually just surface level. If we want to like get rid of gender-based violence, there's all of this that's under the surface that we also need to be addressing. Rape culture, anti-Blackness, economic oppression, colonization, right? It's like the systemic stuff that we actually have to be working to dismantle because those uphold the systems that enable gender-based violence. And if we go to the next slide, so, you know, the next slide really talks about you have this spectrum when it comes to addressing gender-based violence from prevention to intervention. And oftentimes folks put a lot of resources and energy into kind of beefing up and working on the intervention part of it, right? So you might have reporting mechanisms for law enforcement or coming up with ways to hold perpetrators accountable within institutions through firing and banning. But that's always kind of after the assault has already happened or the misconduct has been done. You're not looking again at kind of the root causes of what even led to that instance happening, right? Those forms of gender-based violence occurring. So kind of just naming that very explicitly. And the reason why so much of our state resources actually go to the intervention portion, right? Like the post-reporting portion of it is because they're not approaching this through an intersectional lens, right? So if you go to the next slide, you know, we have to really acknowledge and pay tribute to Kimberly Crenshaw for bringing this framework into the work itself. So for those who are unfamiliar with intersectionality, it is the complex and cumulative ways in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups, right? So keeping it real, a lot of what you see in the Office of Violence Against Women, it was created by white women, right? So they're not navigating multiple layers of oppression or having to think through multiple layers of their identity, which means that there's multiple systems of oppression that are working against them. So they're just like, oh, well, yeah, of course we can just go to the police and file a police report, no big deal. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see if we're applying this kind of framework of intersectionality to Muslim survivors that we work with, you know, at heart, you have to be thinking of how these different things interact with each other to think about for the solutions. You can't just be focusing on the interventions that rely on the state, because guess what? We're not, sometimes there are other layers of what's happening in the state that are working against us as well. So if we're looking at folks' gender identity, race, you know, religious identity, all of those things need to be taken into consideration when we're thinking of solutions, when we're thinking of how to challenge gender-based violence. And if you go to the next slide, I actually don't remember what the next slide is because my computer froze. Okay, so really quick, I do want to share, so knowing that, it then makes sense for why you have so many survivors in our communities who are not reporting, right? Who are not disclosing either within the community or to kind of the state services that are supposed to be serving them. So you have, you know, there aren't trained staff in these kind of more secular agencies that understand the nuance of working with Muslim survivors and the multiple layers and systems of oppression that they're dealing with. You also have, even within leadership of congregations or leadership of Muslim institutions, do they have folks who are navigating those multiple layers as well? Or is it kind of just like a bunch of middle-aged Muslim men, right? Like, we have to really be thinking about, if the representation isn't in leadership and they're expected to go to leadership to report, will they feel safe enough to do so? So that acts as a barrier. What messages are they also getting from those spaces about whether or not those kinds of disclosures are welcome in that space and how they're going to be held through that process? Or are the institutions themselves set up to uphold certain power structures where they're like, actually, if we get this information, we might actually just try to silence it and do the opposite to maintain certain power? And then, you know, there's very little interaction. Like, we had a training the other day where we were talking to direct service providers, and we said, how many of you have actively been building relationships with your Muslim communities to build trust? Because it's very reasonable for Muslim communities to be skeptical of you if you're coming in as like a white person into their religious space and they're like, we want to help you. We're like, we got to like first start with relationship building in order to bridge that gap where trust is built, and you can actually also not dismiss their concerns as paranoia. And if you go to the next slide, so there's multiple, you know, like barriers to disclosing if you've experienced gender-based violence and state-sanctioned gender-based violence as well within Muslim communities, but I want to focus actually on the external ones, right? So we know that some of the very agencies, so if you go to the next one, which is the external barriers, some of the very agencies where people are expected to report are housed in the same spaces where they might be experiencing other forms of violence, right? So police brutality, surveillance, CVE, you know, there's lots of different policies that are enacted to surveil their bodies. And so how are they expected to go to those same agencies to report gender-based violence? And then obviously you have a political climate that is inherently anti-Black, it is Islamophobic, it is racist. And so to build that kind of trust with state institutions will require a lot of actually dismantling the ways that those state institutions are functioning. And then of course you have the backdrop of the war on terror. you go to the last one. So all of that has also led to the exotification of violence in Muslim communities, right? So something so simple as you think of the Oscars, right? So I live in Los Angeles. I love Hollywood. My husband's a filmmaker. I consume a lot of media. And two of the films that I want to point out to that have won Oscars are great films, but what are they about? One is about acid attacks and the other is about honor killings, right? Sharmeen Obaid, great filmmaker. But there's a reason why the Oscars, a predominantly white institution in Hollywood, decided to award those narratives because it fits their idea and kind of puts a stamp on their ideas of what violence in Muslim communities, gendered forms of violence in Muslim communities looks like, right? So why is it that we are constantly obsessed with exotifying these forms of violence in Muslim communities? And like, even so something simple as like saying honor killings versus just domestic or intimate partner violence. Like, well, guess what? There's a lot of ego and dynamics with regards to power and control and maintaining honor in simple cases of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, but we exotify what happens in Muslim communities as honor killing still. And so, yeah, so there's lots of, language that gets put on describing violence in Muslim communities, which further otherizes us and serves to isolate us and isolates the types of resources that we can get to address violence in our communities. And also this idea that violence is not a problem that's inherent to Islam or being Muslim, but that's how it's communicated, right? So a lot of survivors that come forward, they also get met with this like, well, what can you expect? You're Muslim, right? This is what is going to happen in your religion, because there's stereotypes that folks are holding around how violence is experienced in our communities. Okay, so I'm going to now pass it off to Yezen to close us out with just, well, what do we do with all this information and how do we make sense of it? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sahar, and thank you, Draksha. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So basically, I know that Draksha did a very thorough breakdown of what gendered Islamophobia is and what the specific overlaps are. And I think with Sahar's breakdown of gender-based violence, those two different vantage points are, on a practical level, what really informed us wanting to come together to make this coalition. So in a very, very simple sense, what Draksha is talking about is how there are different violences that Muslim communities, specifically trans and Muslim women, experience certain types of state violence at the hands of really Islamophobic governments. And then what Sahar is talking about with gender-based violence is that even within communities, Muslim survivors are also experiencing violence that they're trying to navigate. And so for us in the coalition, what we are trying to address is there's a gap. There's a gap for Muslim survivors in trying to access resources from the state because of all the things that Sahar laid out about how it's dangerous for survivors to try to seek support from the state. And then from what Draksha laid out, there's also a lot of gaps in how Muslim communities can organize together safely and resist state violence, right? Like if the government is enacting violence against a community, and there's also violence within a community, which there's violence within every community because of how everyone is socialized in this world, what happens to people who are trapped in this violence? What happens to the people who are just incubating in this? And that's really what this coalition is trying to address, is how can we create a pathway for ourselves and for our community members who are stuck in this bind? And so if we go to the next slide, that was just kind of a sample of all the different ways that we've seen gendered Islamophobia manifest in reproductive justice, in the war on terror, in academia. But yes, what I kind of wanted to do a little bit, I don't have that much time, but I just wanted to go into a couple of different examples, case studies, to really break down in depth what Draksha and Sahar are talking about. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is the relationship between gendered Islamophobia and surveillance. And so Sahar, in one of her last slides, had touched on how there's a hesitancy in survivors to go to the government or to go to government agencies for support in escaping violence. And so these types of frameworks are what inform that. So a very basic example is if you look at how these different institutions address Muslim women specifically: the United States military, the Department of Homeland Security, the United Nations. I also included oh, great, thank you. I also included the International Rescue Committee, which is, I assume folks are familiar, but it's one of the world's largest nonprofit services that supports refugee communities all around the world. They have offices on every continent in this planet. They are one of the highest grossing organizations supporting refugees in the world. These are just some of the people who have identified Muslim women as integral to countering violent extremism and to reducing terrorism. And this is just 4 of hundreds and hundreds of organizations who do this. I chose these 4 because they are some of the most well-known and they are some of the largest in our context. So the background is actually an image taken from a flyer of the United Nations from an initiative called Women, Peace, and Security. And that specific initiative is an international law that many countries have selected to enact in their own. They've ratified them in their own countries, including the United States. The United States ratified it in 2017. Women, Peace, and Security is an initiative that specifically relies on women in the fight against terrorism or extremism. And so it's a framework that says women play a special role in countering violent extremism, in countering terrorism, and in fighting back. And if you read these reports, there are hundreds and hundreds you could pick from. They specify that women can either be promoters of terrorism, like Draksha was talking about, or they can be the people who fight against it. And so on the one hand, that's really sexist, essentialist readings of women, like women are mothers, women are sisters, women take care of people so they can raise people to not be terrorists is one of the logics. And then the other is if women are involved in resistance movements, they are victims who are forced into being suicide bombers. They are victims who are forced into political activity. They're being used, they need to be rescued. Those are typically the frameworks that women are approached with, Muslim women. And I'm very intentionally using the word Muslim women because this is the framing. It's very, very cis. It's very basic. It's very much like Muslim women. Yes, women have no agency, no identity, no political conviction. So if a woman chooses to engage in resistance movements, she's doing so because she's being forced to, not because she's actually opposed to the United States military militarizing her town or her home, right? These are the kinds of assumptions that are made. And so what's important that I think Seher and Draksha in both of their talking points really used things that are institutionalized and that are normal everyday ways of thinking as part of their examples. And specifically that graphic that Draksha used of the pyramid, I was going to do it the wrong way, going downwards. I can't do it. I feel very stuck. Or Seher's iceberg underneath. In the same way, I think something here that you can envision as an iceberg underneath is a lot of these nonprofits and these government agencies say that they're addressing women's issues, they're helping women, but the iceberg underneath that they never actually reference or acknowledge is war. So even if you listen to the CEO of the International Rescue Committee talk about his work and the relationship between refugeehood and religion and sectarian violence and displacement and death and all these things, he will never once mention war as a factor in migration. It's always sectarian difference between Muslim and Christians or Shia and Sunni. It's always poverty in a country like Iraq that's pushing people out of it, not the US bombing Iraq, right? So this framing is really important when we're thinking of gendered Islamophobia, because what happens is women are either victimized as people who are forced into resistance or as people who should enact change in their communities. But the fact of the matter is the context that they're experiencing a lot of violence in is through war, right? So if we can go to the next slide. So this person is named Musarat Qadim, and she is actually the director of a few different nonprofits and government agencies. And her specific entry point, she is from Pakistan and she does her work primarily in Pakistan, but she's also become someone who's consulted all over the world in addressing extremism in Muslim communities. And she is someone who firmly believes that women can and do play an active role in either countering violent extremism or enacting it. And so her primary nonprofit that she runs is one that socializes Muslim women into becoming informants for their community, essentially. And the way that she frames it is Muslim women raise their sons, Muslim women take care of their siblings, Muslim women are usually heads of community spaces. They are the people who are the most responsible in making sure that terrorism is not normalized in a community. And so this narrative that she gives, she did a talking, she gave a lecture in San Diego once, and this was during her time as part of a fellowship that specifically funds women doing important work around the world. During that talk, Musarat talked about how she helped a mother who was mourning the fact that her son was a terrorist. And in the story that she gives, her son is a terrorist because he bombed out a US military encampment and a national, so Pakistan's military encampment of the unregulated territories where there is a lot of tensions between communities who are fighting to get away from government control and from US militarization as well. So the United States and Pakistan working together to hone in on specifically terrorist movements that are fighting for their own autonomy within these regions, right? And so she's specifically talking about these tensions. And what she says is this person who tried to bomb out the US military is a terrorist because he did this thing. She does not actually say that US military violence is something that should be opposed or should be ousted. The legitimacy of militarization in different regions impacting community is not something that she ever addresses. And so this is really important to think about because we have our community experiencing a lot of state violence, and it's important to think about what types of violence are considered legitimate or not. So this woman is to blame for her son being a terrorist, but the United States military is not responsible for killing people, for bombing people out, for having people live in contexts where they don't have resources. And so it's really important to look at how gender and feminism gets manipulated into this is somehow progressive, when the fact of the matter is it's manipulating feminism to reinforce militarization and in a way that's not actually going to be helpful to community on the ground, right? Exactly, it's neglecting the root factors. If we can go to the next slide. And so this is another example. This is the United States resolution. So there's multiple resolutions from the United Nations, that looks at the relationship between women, peace, and security. And this is a quote that says, women's peace movements must be revived at the community level, the national level, and the international level to fight extremism. They must find common cause with all women all over the world and not only in certain parts. And so if you read this, it's very much a sort of like global sisterhood narrative that sounds really progressive, that sounds really inviting, that sounds like it's very much supporting the access to resources for women all over the world. And then on the top left, it says CVE, which is Countering Violent Extremism, activities represent a range of initiatives designed to identify and prevent threats arising from violent extremism. And so what's important here is these threats that they're referencing really consolidate an array of different types of movements. But at the heart of them are resistance movements. So all over, if we're talking Somalia, if we're talking Pakistan, if we're talking Afghanistan, if we're talking Syria, if we're talking Palestine, the threat is always the autonomous movements who are resisting US militarization, Zionism, or other forces. And in very practical levels, like this isn't a high theory or a broad example. This is very literally people who have bombed United States military bases in Somalia, community members who've bombed them, are the ones who are called the threat. And so there's no asking of why or what the motivations are for these actions, right? It's this very, very stereotypical Muslims are dangerous, Muslims are violent narrative that takes away the politics that we are so accustomed to. But specifically for gendered Islamophobia, what ends up happening is you also have the erasure of women's experiences with intra-communal violence and with state violence. So women in the community who are subjected to gendered violence at the hands of the United States military. So if we're thinking of bleak examples like Abu Ghraib or these different things, that violence gets overlooked. The fact that rape is a systemic tool used in warfare is completely overlooked, is not referenced in any of these types of programs, right? And then on the flip side, women who are survivors of gender-based violence in their communities don't have actual resources that they can access that address their issues without making them become informants who sell their own communities out and also still will subject them to that state violence. So what ends up happening is survivors are placed in this bind where they either have to continue living with the violence that they're experiencing within their own community, or they will have to sell out that community to get away and also end up leaving their life behind and any political autonomy, right? Like the choices are very, very violent. Exactly. So they do not promote alternative means of resistance, and they also neglect a lot of the important pieces. They neglect the complicated components. And so I think that's really important to think about, is that gendered Islamophobia is very, very complicated. And when things get complicated is typically when people's experiences and narratives get erased. And I think another important thing to just bear in mind is some of the programs that I've read about do encourage mothers to listen to their conversations of their family members at dinner and come back and share what they've heard back. So an example that I read is refugee camps in Lebanon. So these were either Palestinian or Syrian refugees, and forgive me for not remembering which, because there were multiple programs taking place in Lebanon at the time. It was a vocational workshop for Muslim mothers to try to give them skill building, to be able to get employment, to be able to make money and leave the refugee camp. But part of their protocol, just along the lines of vocational training, included listen to conversations. If you hear family members or friends saying things that are critical of the United States government or critical of Israel, let your program directors at this nonprofit know. Right? So these very, very intimate spaces become spaces where now the government has their ears in. If we can go to the next slide. And then last but not least, this is an example from Vigilant Love, Services Not Surveillance campaign. And so Vigilant Love, we are a healing justice organization. And one of our campaigns, Services Not Surveillance, is looking at how countering violent extremism is being weaponized to undermine people's access to mental health resources, and how the Department of Homeland Security has a very high investment in accessing therapy rooms in different spaces to try to infiltrate different community spaces. This specific case study was taken from a study done by Thaudit Yunus, who's a scholar in the UK, and his work on Prevent, which is the counterpart to CVE. It's the UK counterpart. And this narrative for Joan, folks can take the time to read it, but I can also summarize it. It's basically a woman who had been seeking services for trauma she'd experienced, gender-based violence she'd experienced in a relationship with someone. And she started seeking therapy on that note. And during that time, when she was seeking the therapy, she had said she was seeking it for her experiences with intimate partner violence. And this is when she started the point. And from then on out, Joan started seeing someone else, started seeing a Muslim person, decided to convert to Islam, decided to wear the hijab, and even though she was going there to continue processing her trauma from her previous partnership in which she had experienced gender-based violence, the therapist started fixating on her conversion to Islam and started questioning whether or not she was doing so willingly, started questioning whether or not she was someone who was potentially becoming involved in extremist efforts. And so this led her on a path of having to question whether or not she could still seek the services that she needed for her own trauma from experiencing violence, because now it was becoming clear that her individual choices were being questioned, her autonomy was being questioned, and also her safety was being put on the side. And exactly, Amina, this is a close examination of one narrative, but it's one of hundreds of thousands that I know we could name. And I know Seher and Draksha alone could name dozens like this. And so Joan, in the end, ended up discontinuing these sessions. And so this is a super, super scary, tragic, unfortunate, and real thing. Of course, it makes sense for this person to stop seeking services because now they are putting themselves at risk, they're putting their partner at risk, they're putting their partner's family at risk by continuing to seek services, but they have to do so at the expense of their own trauma, right? Joan is in essence sacrificing herself to make sure that everyone else around her stays safe. So her healing doesn't get to happen because now her healing will become at the expense of everyone else. And so these types of binaries are the kinds that we see Muslim survivors being forced into time and time again. And so this ties back to surveillance also, but is very much related to, I think, a lot of what Sahar was talking about for survivors. Anyway, I'm sorry if I went over. These are just a couple of in-depth dives into some of the examples of how we can really see gendered Islamophobia manifesting and why it's so important to really address this in depth and talk about it and map it out and normalize this conversation. Because like Draksha was saying, a lot of policy platforms don't have a gendered analysis, but if you look at women, peace, and security on the United States level, it's tens of millions of dollars that go into that initiative. It is billions of dollars that go into peacekeeping initiatives for war from the United States military. So gender is a very, very high concern for them. And so because of that, it also needs to be one in our organizing communities, just practically speaking, in addition to, of course, our responsibility to our community members who are experiencing violence and deserve access to healing and resources, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sitting here taking it all in, and amazing. This is really amazing work. And I really want to sit with a lot of this. And thank you for sharing the links to the Gendered Islamophobia report, because I know that people will want to go back and spend some time with them. This is a really good introduction to that work, but as you can tell, a lot of this is something that you really need to spend a little more time with, because connecting these dots takes a lot of work. I mean, I've participated in just a little bit of the deliberations of these organizations where they have come up with this report. And it's really complex work because a lot of the time what we're doing is we're looking at these things in isolation from each other. We're just saying, okay, how do we address sexism? Okay, how do we address Islamophobia? Okay, how do we address, like, you know, the Muslim ban or xenophobia or something like that, right? So this analysis is so valuable, and I so appreciate all your work. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And I'm just so grateful that the work you all do. And I want people to be aware of the work that organizers do, and on shoestring budgets very often, and on their own time, with no sort of respect for their personal time or rest, or very often. And I just so appreciate all the work that they do and the work that they are and yes, please donate to all of their organizations. No, absolutely, 100%. Because I mean, and this is partly why I brought you to this event, is to make communities aware of the work that you all are doing, because very often we're only focused on, say, an Islamic center, right? We're going to pray there. Okay, that makes sense. Or we're focused on, I don't know, like, oh, we need to vote for so-and-so so that that other so-and-so doesn't get elected, right? So these are very often our, our focus. And we don't realize all the work that is going on in the background that organizers are doing to fight these very big powers, right? This is not small powers. They're not fighting for you to be able to, like, not be not be kicked out of a job or something like that. They're not fighting for those individual things. They're fighting for systemic cultural change. And that takes a lot of work. So I want to encourage you to go back and look at, and very often the organizations that get donations are the ones that are, like, using individual figureheads or famous people or one famous case, and Muslim communities get all excited about that. Oh, that one person suffered this. But this is like systemic change. This is work that is going to affect entire communities, and it is more international in focus, and it's focusing on our children, our grandchildren, our solidarity with other marginalized communities. So, yeah, it's a huge paradigm shift. Right. And so we have to start thinking in those terms. I think a lot of our Muslim communities have learned to kind of shift their paradigms in a lot of ways. I remember the times when people were saying, well, we have to stay in our bubbles and we really can't interact at all. But now we're really come, a long way, but we still have a long way to go. So thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I know that it must have taken a lot out of you, because you work with the people who experience these things. And so I want to bring this back a little bit to you. I'm really touched and moved by the work that you did, and really moved by the fact that your work brings together, and it's very rare to bring an analysis like this to gendered violence, right? That brings also together military violence, and also brings together interpersonal violence, and also brings together racism and sexism and sort of all of these things, right? That we don't usually bring together. We usually try to keep them in boxes, right? And that's why all of this is, like, for some people, I'm sure, is very, heavy to take in. So I really wanted to take a moment to ask you why you do this. Like, how did you come to this work? Because this is very heart heavy work, and it's also very deeply intellectual work and very analytical work, and it's very demanding. So I just want to ask you, each of you, how you came to this work, a little bit about your stories. So shall we go first with Yazan? Yazan, shall we go with you first?
Sure. You mean just what brings me here today?
Yeah, no, to this work that you did.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think on a practical level, I started working for Vigilant Love over a year ago. I lost track of time. It's actually gonna be 2 years this year. Wow, time. Okay. Anyway, but in that,
right?
exactly. But I think I've always been organizing in spaces that look at gender and look at surveillance and the war on terror. And that's always been my own personal research interests. I personally am very much interested in how specifically feminism or LGBTQ rights get co-opted, like when we're thinking of Zionism and pinkwashing, or if we're thinking of the war in Afghanistan in the United States military. Like, these kinds of examples are very important to me, because I think it's really interesting to see how, if you frame or like portray a narrative a certain way, it convinces people of things that they actually in principle claim to be opposed to. So many people claim to be opposed to war, but if you just say, well, the war is in the name of women, all of a sudden they're not anti-war anymore. And it becomes, well, this is for the better good. It's unfortunate, but we'll do it. And I think those kinds of narratives really interest me, because it's actually the liberal ideas of like war is an unfortunate evil, or those things that I think are much more dangerous for communities than people who are flat out racist or these things. Because vigilante racists and war loving people and those things, they're actually a very like, they're very loud and sensationalist, but they're a minority. It's mostly people who think that war is an unfortunate evil, or who think that like these kinds of things, they're the ones who perpetuate these ideas, or who believe in saving people, or these kinds of narratives. Like, it's these kinds of ideas that I think are a lot harder to undo in people. And so researching those things has always been really interesting to me. And on a level of my work with Vigilant Love, I know that I came into Vigilant Love when they were knee deep in doing their countering violent extremism work. And there was a lot of efforts in Los Angeles that were happening to fight against what would have been the accepted mayor's grant, which was several $100,000. And so my own research was looking at countering violent extremism in San Diego at the time. And in getting to organize with Vigilant Love through my own role in the Palestinian Youth Movement, the PYM, I got to meet Vigilant Love folks. And the start for this coalition really came from, I would say, Seher Draksha, from the work that JMC does, and from everything that Heart has already been doing. There were a lot of conversations that came out from them, and my interest in it, and I think our interest in including Vigilant Love, was really wanting to look more in depth at specifically CVE and gendered Islamophobia. I think that there's a lot of amazing analysis that Heart and JMC already have. And it's really, really cool. And I'm very honored that Vigilant Love gets to be included in that conversation. I feel like most presentations are usually sitting and just witnessing Heart and witnessing Seher and Draksha, really, because there's just so many years of experience that they have, especially if you factor in the narratives of survivors and grassroots organizing, base building with people on this level. I think like their two organizations are incomparable in that. And I think that Vigilant Love is building out in a lot of ways that analysis, but I feel like most of my experience so far has been learning. So I want to let Seher and Draksha talk more about their own work and experiences.
Yeah. Daraksha, you want to go next? That's so wonderful. I love that story. And I'm particularly valuing these stories because, then I can really see myself in that. I can really see myself trying to make sense of all of these things. Yeah. Daraksha, tell us about your story and tell us a little bit about JMC.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of JMC, so myself and Dr. Maha Hilal envisioned and co-founded Justice for Muslims Collective in October of 2016. And we did it because we're in Washington, D.C., where a lot of the Muslim organizations tend to be very much agents of the state in terms of promoting state policies. They're on the forefront of giving CVE credibility. And so as Muslim women, for us, being in this space, we felt it was really important to carve out an alternative way of being Muslims and being politically engaged. And I think for me in particular, it was really important to center gender justice, the leadership of Muslim women in particular. I mean, I come from the Bronx in New York City, when the heat of 9/11 happened and witnessed in a working class community, literally overnight in the first week, men being picked up, put into detention centers, and all the women having to really fight for them and come together. And it was really the Muslim women who came and protected not only the community, but also were there advocating for men who were being criminalized. I mean, we think about that now of like when NSEERS, I remember the days in which, our community members knocked on our door being like, NSEERS has been implemented. If you don't go sign up for NSEERS, they're going to deport you all. So I grew up in a lot of trauma watching the violence against our communities and seeing Muslim women not only fight for the rights of men, but also being victims of hate violence, the level of discrimination they experienced at the workplace, and navigating that and not really having a community that was centering the ways in which Muslim women and girls were experiencing violence. I mean, there are stories of sexual violence, of like rape that never got told in our community because of the shame and stigma. But I know as a young, sort of 13, 14-year-old, that the terror that Muslim girls were experiencing, who were like, take off your headscarf, go in packs, you never know, there's a lot of violence happening. And so I think that left a real imprint in my mind of like, if we're going to do any kind of advocacy or organizing, that gender has to be at the center, not just as I think women are always organizing, but we are used for the liberation of men, but we're not actually always centering how also women and girls get impacted by state violence and the intersection of gender-based violence. I mean, the other thing is also there was an increase of GBV, there was an increase of DV, of sexual assault in the community, and women did not come forward at all out of fear that we would be pushing Islamophobia against the community. I think growing up in that is the reason why, for me, when JMC, we started and co-founded it, it was so important to me that gender not be seen as a separate thing, but it was integral to the fight against Islamophobia. It is integral to the leadership that we're also building. And then not to also separate civil rights, civil rights work from the work of anti-violence or gender justice. So often we treat survivors of violence and GB work as separate from the work against civil rights. And the two are really seen as odds. And so for me, it was important that when we're again advocating, survivors of violence have to be centered in leadership. Like, we can't separate these fights. They're actually integrated within each other. So I think for me, that really shaped why JMC has a focus on gendered Islamophobia and GBV. And in particular, in my work over the past 10 years, I still remember my entry point into working in the DV courts in New York City. And there was this one instance 10 years ago when I was probably, I think, in my second year of my grad program, where I was in a courtroom and there was an Afghan woman who had been beaten by her husband, and she was seeking an order of protection. And her husband at that point literally used the negative portrayal of Islam as patriarchal to his defense. His defense attorney got in front of the judge and was like, you know what? GV is part of the Muslim community. It's part of Islam. And the judge gave into that and did not give her an order of protection as a result of that. And I think being in that court and watching the treatment of Muslim women versus like white women, it was so clear to me that this is a clear example of how Islamophobia is weaponized in the courts to literally, I mean, this woman was shattered. Like, she had come forward, her children had watched her. I mean, he had just beat her bloodied on the floor. And this judge was like, yeah, I know, that's how your community is. So it's not a big deal. And I think over the years, that strand of listening to stories, witnessing it kept on coming up over and over again for me. And I was like, it's really important that we find a space to center this gendered Islamophobia work. And then about 5 years ago in DC, some folks came to me, survivors of sexual assault, who said that in the DC area, there was a man who was claiming to be part of the FBI, who had been basically engaging in multiple relationships and was sexually assaulting Muslim women. And he was saying that if the women came forward, he would go to the FBI and report them as terrorists. And I remember like talking to folks who were going through this and the fear that they were living with. And at that point, when I reached out to a civil rights org in the Muslim community to talk about this and like, hey, I think we should talk to maybe law enforcement, we should think about services, they just completely wrote it off as like, this is not a civil rights issue. This is not that serious. And so I think for me, just over the past 10 years, this theme has come up over and over again, and really feeling like there wasn't a space, an org, folks really focusing on it, which is why I think meeting like Hart, Nadia, and like the work that they have done, and then meeting Saher, you know, one of the only other people that was like sitting at that intersection of GBV and Islamophobia, like I was like, whoa, I'm not alone anymore. And I think like, you know, without that partnership, without Saher, without Hart's leadership, like finally we have an explicit space to center gendered Islamophobia and bring us together. And the fact that we're now at 20 years after 9/11, like this should have been happening much earlier, but you know, never like, better be late than like never. But again, I just am really grateful for the partnership with Hart and VL, and both for Saher and Yazin, because we are all really committing ourselves to this work and making the time for it. And I hope that, you know, inshallah, that there's a lot of barakah and blessings in this and that we can make some change. But that's the story of how, you know, I got involved, how JMC did it, and like, what were the actual cases that brought this forth? Like, we do need an analysis and work around gendered Islamophobia.
Thank you so much, Darakhshan. Such a powerful story. I know I've talked to you about other stories, and it's just, this is like, you know, the tip of the iceberg, a lot of these things. So you really, in many ways, when I talk to you all, I feel like you carry the heart of the community. It's really, you know, a service that is like indefinable in its extent. So I'm so grateful. May Allah reward all of you. So Sahar, let's go. Tell us.
I'm like, I need like several minutes to process. SubhanAllah. No, Dee, I think, you know, it's unfortunate that the stories that you're sharing are from coast to coast, right? Like, I'm on the West Coast in Los Angeles. This is not something that is uncommon, and it's also something I'm just sick of. Like, just being real, like I just couldn't find the space where this intersection was uplifted in a way that aligned with my values. Like I navigate both worlds of like being in anti-Islamophobia organizing spaces where you have perpetrators of violence who get under the banner of the fact that maybe they know how to talk about Islamophobia. They get away with so much like patriarchal crap and like are actually harming people in community, but we don't want to touch them because they are, you know, the poster children of anti-Islamophobia organizing, right? Then you have the gender-based violence spaces that are predominantly run by like white women who have really perpetuated stereotypes about Muslim women. Like I'll be on panels where I'll be like the token Muslim, and they'll be like, wow, you look like such an empowered Muslim woman, not like those other ones wearing burqas. And I have to like snap back. And I think just the exhaustion of having to navigate both of those spaces, I was like, I'm done. Like, let's just make our own, right? And like, Darakhshan is like, you know, someone I look up to. I've been like a fangirl for years, just like checking on Twitter and Facebook for your wise words and guidance. And it was always like anything that would be happening in the community or in the world that needed a certain type of commentary, Dee comes at it with like the perfect analysis. And I'm always like, yes, +1 to that. Like, but there were very few other folks who I felt were navigating and straddling both of these worlds in a way that was also aligned with my vision for the world, that was also abolitionist. I think that's another big part of it, is that even in anti-Islamophobia organizing spaces, the folks that get resources are still folks that are trying to work with the state in very harmful ways that oftentimes throw marginalized Muslims under the bus, right? And then you have in gender-based violence spaces, it's like still this like insistence that we just need to train police to be better. And I'm just like, I don't want to train police. I don't want to work with police. Like, that for me is haram. Like, I actually don't think it is Islamically okay for me to do that, because I have limited energy, limited resources, and I'd rather work and use that towards the liberation for my community versus trying to come up with these band-aid solutions that I know are just going to do more harm than good. And then also just my lived experience. Like, I am a Muslim woman who has navigated multiple spaces, especially with regards to reproductive and sexual health. And I was tired of experiencing gendered Islamophobia in the medical field and in mental health spaces. Like, I did my social work degree from USC, and it is one of the most painful spaces to do a social work degree because they are highly invested in partnerships with law enforcement, like throwing social workers into police stations and kind of validating military social work, right? So, and like, there was no analysis on like, well, maybe we should stop engaging in war. It was always the band-aid solutions of what services can we provide to veterans. And I was just tired of it, like having to tiptoe around hurting people's feelings while on the other side, like, I was disposable. My feelings and the triggers that I would get from people casually talking about their deployments to different Muslim majority countries for US imperialism was completely ignored. And so navigating all of those spaces, I was just like, done. So it's been in the same vein that it's been a breath of fresh air to put this coalition together and work on these in very values aligned, intentional ways. It's been spiritually healing for me to be in a space where my Muslimness isn't invalidated because of the politics I hold, right? The shaming that happens in Muslim spaces around activism is spiritually draining. And so I was tired of also just the silencing and the erasure of the ways that I'm navigating activism being un-Islamic. And so pushing back against that. And then it's also just like, you know, we're constantly the caretakers and the holders for folks who have nowhere else to go. And I wanted a space where we could be held together as well. So I think that the healing justice that we bring into the coalition space, into the gendered Islamophobia space, is for literally the intention of making sure this work is sustainable. So also just like the toxicity of working in anti-Islamophobia organizing spaces that don't allow for breaks, that don't allow for processing, that shut down processing feelings, I was tired of it. So I really appreciate kind of what we're building that is also intentional about creating space to process feelings, because that's part of the work. It shouldn't be normal that we hear stories like what the Raksha shared and we don't have an emotional reaction to it. Like, I need that to be able to continue to do this work.
Yeah, that was so powerful. And I was just thinking about the question, and I just noticed that Mike is saying that, yes, that is a partial response also to his question about institutional corruption and how victims of violence have so few options available, right? Because the institutions we turn to are also corrupted by these sorts of racisms, as well as corruption and violence, right? So the question, I think, was originally, how do they get corrupted in the first place? And I think a lot of what you're talking about addresses that. Did you want to add to that? Of how, you know, what are, and you've talked about what are our alternatives, right? What are our alternatives in terms of addressing these kinds of violence, right? So we do these in our organizations, in our these spaces that are safer, that are holding our communities. But did you want to talk a little more about that? What is the option for a person that is experiencing this kind of violence?
I think we need to look to the leadership of Black movement leaders who have been working on gender-based violence for alternatives with regards to transformative justice and restorative justice. We need to be creative. We can't just regurgitate the same punitive measures and investigations as a solution to addressing harm in community. So I feel like it's like a thing where people want to just feel like they're in a sense of power and control by saying, like, labeling somebody as like, this person has done harm, let's just dispose of them. That's not going to solve their behavior, right? That's not going to solve the systemic issues. So it takes a lot. Like, I feel like we actually have to be ready to confront how institutionally, individually, we are perpetuating harm in community, right? So like at every Muslim institution, I would love for them to do an assessment about who's in leadership, what systems do they have in place to actually promote that punitive, like, kind of culture where like people are scared to call out harm because they know it's going to just be ignored, or they have like a bro culture where they're just like protecting each other. Like, they have to do an assessment of how they're maintaining that kind of culture and how they're going to tear it down. And then also just, I think we also need to invest money. Like, we actually have to take our money, take it out of whatever you're using it for that's useless, and put it into resources to promote and support survivors in ways that don't rely on the state, right? Like, and that requires people to sit with their feelings. And I think people are just like, don't want to do it because it's too hard, but they actually have to do that, right? Like, they have to do that. And that's a big part of the work, is like, you have to be okay with holding space and that being part of the work. You have to be okay with admitting to when you're doing harm, because that's part of the work. So those are just some of the things I think about in terms of alternatives. It's like, it requires a whole culture shift of how we're navigating in community, how we're navigating in relationship to each other, and what we're investing our money in as resources. Healing circles are great, right? Like, I think the Raksha and JMC are leading the way when it comes to what it means to hold space, and just acknowledging that these times are not normal. This is not normal to be navigating what we're navigating today.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I wanted to also give a plug for the healing circles that Chaplain Yasmin Yunus runs, and she is a chaplain for Justice for Muslims Collective. See, that also reflects the approach for these organizations, is that they are not just doing the work to address these kinds of military violence and the multiple layers of violence, but they're also addressing how you as a person deserve to heal. Right? The things that we as human beings, as bodies and souls and hearts, we need to heal, right? And that we also need to heal from the kind of violence that we do to ourselves and to the people that work with us, right? And so if you look at, for example, Afghanistan, right, the way that harm is addressed by the United States by doing more harm, right? As if by putting troops on the ground and punishing people and bombing weddings, we're going to then fix everything. And so if you look at the prison industrial complex, how prisons are treated, we're going to throw people into prison en masse, and this is going to fix everything. And this is not the way to go. So this is a larger kind of abolitionist way of thinking that we have to think more carefully about, which entails not putting all of our eggs into the state violence basket. So I'm really hoping that in the future we can have a larger conversation about that as well. Yeah, pulling in another invitation, I think. So thank you so much. This was a beautiful conversation. And I'm going to hand it over now to Romana so we can sort of tie up and tie up with a ribbon and conclude. I've put in the chat the links to these organizations. You can support them. If this work that we've talked about means something to you, then I would really recommend that you support these organizations, because this is the work that we all need. And it is on shoestring budgets. And the integrity of the work demands that they rely on your donations and not on the state. So that really is needed. So when you rely on individuals, then you can be accountable to community members, not to broader other agendas that don't have enough in common with you. So thank you so much, everybody. And Romana, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Deep, deep gratitude to you all, you powerhouse organizers, leaders, researchers, scholars. Thank you for taking us all on a deep dive into these concepts and frameworks that shape the work that you all do and why it is important. It is so, so important. For those participating, you can find the links, as Dr. Shabana said, in the chat, but also they're on our website too. So if you didn't catch them there, you can go to our website under the event webpage, and the links are there. Please support them and their work. It is critical. It's needed. Big ups to you all. May God bless you all in your efforts. Ameen, inshallah. And thank you all for participating, for your questions. Let's continue this work together, God willing. And yeah, stay tuned for more events and updates. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.